friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is the Before You Read lecture on what scholars regard or name 2nd and 3rd Isaiah, or the additions to Isaiah, chapters 39 through 66. As we open up this material, it is almost immediately clear that there is a new tone, a new perspective, a new sense about this writing or these chapters. These chapters are filled with consolation and even optimism and hope for a better future. It's important to recognize that the reason why scholars regard these as different is because they likely originate from a different geopolitical perspective. They arise from a different moment in history. They arise from different experiences. And as a result of that, these chapters from Isaiah lead to the reinterpretation of certain realities and beliefs that include the nature of suffering. What does it mean to suffer, and why are the people of God suffering? They reinterpret the place of the Davidic monarchy and its importance for Israel and the people of Israel. And it reinterprets the place of the Gentiles, the non-Judeans, the foreigners, in God's purposes and God's plans. Just as a quick reminder, it's probably worth reviewing why the majority of biblical scholars think of this threefold division between Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, the 66 chapters that make up the canonical book of Isaiah. So as a reminder, the first 39 chapters, or the majority of those chapters, scholars generally recognize as associated with the 8th century BCE, so pre-Babylonian exile, connected with the prophet Isaiah of Jerusalem, who we know from some other biblical writings. And like other prophets from the 8th century, there are certain sort of emphases and characteristics that make this part of Isaiah distinct from the remainder of Isaiah. There's the warning of judgment. There is the interest in what we would call social justice, as well as some idol worship and some issues there. In Isaiah chapters 40 through 55, the tone, as I said before, is more hopeful and optimistic. It really seems to be a response to the end of exile, to the end of this traumatic and painful experience, this collective experience, and really anticipates the return to Jerusalem. Chapters 56 through 66, now there is some debate among scholars about whether or not that's a valid division. So some would just divide it into two parts, but it's similar in tone to chapters 40 through 55. What is of interest is near the end of this section, at least, if not spread throughout, is what appears to be a sense of division among the people of Jerusalem about the place of the temple and of cultic worship in the life of the people of Israel. And so there seems to be a critique of the temple, a critique even of some of the priestly establishment. As John Collins points out in his introduction to the Old Testament, there are major themes that we see throughout Isaiah that we'll see in 2nd and 3rd Isaiah, including the focus on Zion and Jerusalem, identifying God as the Holy One of Israel, or even the King of Israel, the symbolism of light, and the reflection on the new Exodus. Comfort, O comfort, my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. This is the way that 2nd Isaiah opens in chapter 40, verses 1 through 2. You can see this is not a word of judgment. This is not an invitation to repentance. This is a word of comfort, of consolation. This really is the tone of much of 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. And so why? Why is there this dramatic shift in tone in the prophetic book known as Isaiah? Most scholars suggest that it has something to do with Cyrus of Persia in his recent defeat of Babylon in 539 BCE. Babylon has been defeated, the superpower that has dominated Israel and Judah for decades has been defeated. That is a piece of positive news, but Cyrus himself also had a more hands-off approach to ruling his subjected people. He allowed them a good bit of religious and political freedom. As it relates to Jerusalem and the people of Judah, he authorized them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Remember what we have seen in Ezra and Nehemiah. This seems to be the context out of which 2nd Isaiah is written. John Collins describes this with a sense of euphoria, of deep happiness and anticipation among certain Judeans who were so thrilled about what Cyrus had declared. There were really expectations for a new era, a new moment in history, and for these Judeans, this was all God's doing. It was really a miracle of sorts. I want to introduce a few themes that you'll experience in 2nd Isaiah. But first, a brief outline of this section of Isaiah. Chapters 40 through 48 really are a reflection on this new era inaugurated by Cyrus. Chapters 49 through 55, while they maintain some of this reflective, euphoric state, are also dealing with some internal problems faced by the people within the Judean community. The first theme that stands out as you read this material is the idea of new exodus and even new creation. What we get from 2nd Isaiah is that the return from exile really is a second Exodus. And this leads to the position that Exodus, that event thousands of years before or hundreds of years before under Moses, was not a one-time event, but rather Exodus is a fundamental element of God's character. It is a pattern of divine intervention, even in the present moment of 2nd Isaiah. African Americans reading the Bible in and around the abolition of slavery and liberation theology subsequently really captures this same thinking that we see in 2nd Isaiah, that the Exodus is fundamental to the character and nature of God. This is who God is. And so we see that in 2nd Isaiah. In places, the theme of new Exodus sort of merges with the theme of new creation. We get creation language about Yahweh, the God of Israel, battling with the sea monster of chaos to establish creation. And so there is this blending, this emphasis on God's creative power. But what matters to the author and audience of 2nd Isaiah is that both new creation and new Exodus are happening in the present. The second theme that I think you'll encounter in 2nd Isaiah is related to the worship of God. Now, it's important to note that while we talk often in contemporary society about monotheism, the belief in only one single God, that this was a rather late development in the ancient Near East and certainly in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. We really only begin to see what we would regard as true monotheism, the belief that other people are worshiping not different gods, but false gods, fake gods. There's only one God, and it's the God of Israel. This is really where we begin to see that thinking take root in 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. We see these very strong polemical words against idols and idol worship. And Collins, again, helps us understand some of the basic thinking about statutes, about idols in Babylonian worship. It really was believed that the image of the deity represented the presence of God. And so if you did something to that image, or if that image was carried off by another people group, the belief was that God was absent. God's presence was gone. And there were all sorts of rituals to keep these idols awake and open-eyed and even well-fed. So we see in 2nd and 3rd Isaiah some of the strongest and most sarcastic rhetoric about the idols and about idol worship of the non-Jews. Sort of right along with that, oddly, parallel to that, is a stronger sense of universalism, a stronger sense that the God of Judah, the God of Israel, is also the God of the whole world as they know it. There is a demonstrated openness to Gentiles in view of the new thing that God is doing. Gentiles are somehow being included in God's wonderful new creation activity. Of course, they are still subordinate to Israel, but they are present. God is the God of the world, not just of Israel. The final theme that I'd like to point out is the servant of the Lord. There are 4 passages that scholars identify as the so-called servant of the Lord passages. These are Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 4, Isaiah 49, 1 through 6, Isaiah 50, verses 4 through 9, and 52, 13 through 53, 12. Scholars who study Isaiah will note a number of things about these servant of the Lord passages. The first is that there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity about the identity of the servant and whether or not the servant spoken of in one of the poems or one of the passages is the same as the servant spoken of in another. In addition, they never really identify who this servant is, and so interpretive communities have thought about Moses or Cyrus or even the prophet Isaiah or one of his followers as the servant, or perhaps it's an anonymous member of the community. Others have suggested that the servant of the Lord really is Israel personified. It is the group of Israelites who have experienced this hardship and who have gone through exile and all of the trauma that goes with that, and that they are the servant of the Lord collectively. One of the really important things that these passages suggest is that suffering takes on a new meaning. No longer is suffering only or exclusively a punishment for disobedience and sin, but suffering can take on a vicarious way. That somehow the suffering of one can alleviate or atone for the misgivings and the sinfulness of another. And altogether, it's similar to Ezekiel's symbolic action in Ezekiel 4, where he's laying on his side. He's somehow enduring the sins of Israel on their behalf. Really, it's meant to create a response. It's meant to perhaps be modeled or an example, as we see in some of the New Testament texts as well. But above all, these servant songs, as they're known, create a far more positive understanding of suffering than we've seen in Deuteronomy or even in Jeremiah. I want to say just a few things about what is known as 3rd Isaiah, chapters 56 through 66, or it's a shorter bit of Isaiah, and in many places it's similar to what we've seen in Isaiah chapters 40 through 55. There's some commonalities between 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. Perhaps the greatest differences appear in chapters 65 and 66. This is where we begin to see what we might think of as a pronounced division among the community. There seems to be some strong critique and questioning about the validity of the temple and of the whole practice of cultic worship. There seems to be this sense that cultic worship has somehow been perverted. It is causing people to commit other sins, or that there is this sense that because we do this set of cultic worship, this set of rituals or sacrifices, that these become an excuse for other types of sin. In any case, it seems like there was a debate, some frustration going on in the community. In addition to that theme, there is this anticipation of a radical reversal, maybe even to a degree higher than what we saw in Isaiah 40 through 55. There is, a new creation is the right way to talk about it again, and in many ways this radical reversal anticipates some of the sentiment that we'll see in later apocalyptic literature, crisis literature that really imagines the eternal life or hell or the judgment of sinners in a way that we don't see elsewhere in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. Once again, my hope with this Before You Read lecture is that it provides a sense of the persona and the message of the person behind, or persons behind, 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. And so for your reading, I suggest these passages to get a sense of both 2nd and 3rd Isaiah and a little bit of what's going on in these parts of Isaiah. So read Isaiah 40 through 48. This is the consolation and the anticipation of God's new thing. Then read Isaiah 49 through 53, paying particular attention to the servant of the Lord passages. Then read Isaiah 60 through 62, the opening parts of 3rd Isaiah, and Isaiah 65 through 66, the end of Isaiah. And as you read, I encourage you to keep these questions in mind. How do these writings encourage or provide a consolation to those who experienced exile? Second, what images or ideas express Isaiah's hope for the future? Third, what is the role or roles of the servant of the Lord? Do you think this is a one-time thing, a one-time office, or is it something that can be relived? Is it a pattern? And finally, how might this part of Isaiah speak to us today? Many of us watching this now are anticipating an end to COVID times, an end to the exile that we've experienced in 2021. So how might Isaiah speak to us? Well, I hope you appreciate the shift in emphasis that we see in Isaiah 40, and I hope that you have a rich experience reading and thinking about 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. I can't wait to hear from you and see and hear what you've discovered in your reading. Now get to it.